Recently, President Trump announced he's terminating temporary protected status, TPS, for Somalis in the state of Minnesota. Trump called Minnesota a hub of fraudulent money laundering and accused Somali gangs of terrorizing folks there. Minnesota is home to the largest Somali community in the U.S., with 60 to 90,000 people there who have fled Somali's civil war since the 1990s. Since there are only 705 Somalis nationwide on TPS, it's not going to change much, and is more political drama, but it's definitely worth a topic of discussion, especially since there's been an enormous amount of fraud cases in the last few years. And it doesn't help that they have one of the most obnoxious people in Congress, named Ilhan Omar, who is representing many of these people. For this reason, I thought it would be good to look into the pros and cons of Somalis in Minnesota from an economic and political perspective. Since 2019, Minnesota's uncovered at least 28 fraud rings, many tied to Somali networks, siphoning billions from welfare, Medicaid, and NGOs. The biggest one was Feeding Our Future, a $250 million plus child nutrition scam during COVID-19. Nonprofits faked meal sites, bought Lamborghinis, and funneled cash overseas. There are 77 defendants so far that are mostly Somali-owned organizations, and some of the money allegedly went to Al-Shabaab, which is the Al-Qaeda offshoot in Somalia. There was also an autism therapy fraud found. In this case, about $400 million plus was taken from Medicaid. Clinics exploded from 41 to 328 providers that were mostly Somali run. And these plaintiffs aren't all uneducated either. One of the plaintiffs of one of these $14 million rings is Asha Farhan Hassan, who was or is an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota Medical School. One of her research focuses is structural racism and health inequities. She recruited Somali kids for fake diagnoses, paid parents $300 to $1,500 kickbacks per month. They also increased housing aid, which ballooned from $2.6 million to $61 million in half of 2025. There were ghost clients, fake hours, a total scam, which could be up to $100 million. There was also a personal care assistant Medicaid fraud, which has cost taxpayers probably $100 million. So the total cost since 2018 is about $700 million to $1 billion that's been lost, according to the feds. So let's look into the background of this community. So most of these Somalis arrived as poor refugees. They're even worse off than black Minnesotans. About 58% of Somalis are in poverty compared to 29% of blacks in Minnesota. 40 to 58% are on assistance like food stamps or Medicaid, which is higher than whites, which are about 8 to 10%, and most Latino groups, which are about 20 to 30. They also get millions in cash assistance, childcare subsidies, housing, ESL classes, etc. About 40% are unemployed or underemployed. About 59% finish high school, but at least that's rising, and 67% of second generation are going to college, which is good, but it depends on what they're studying. If their research focuses structural racism and health inequities, it's not going to be super helpful for jobs, and it might even make them want to steal from the system that they perceive as being so evil. So what are some of the costs of the Somali community on the Minnesota state budget? So, of course, I mentioned there was about $700 million in fraud since 2018. So that's about $100 million a year. As far as welfare and cash assistance, about $100 to $120 million. Health services, Medicaid, Minnesota Care beyond the federal shares, about $40 to $60 million. Education, K through 12, and ESL classes, $40 to $60 million. Incarceration and justice, $20 to $30 million. They're about 3 to 5% of the prison population, which is overrepresented. but at least not as bad as the native blacks. For housing, mental health, and things like that, you've got about 10 to 20 million. Infrastructure is about 5 million. And then you have to add in government jobs because Somalis and blacks in general are overrepresented in government jobs. That's probably another $100 million in local and state taxes and probably 50 million for federal jobs, which includes Ilhan Omar, who makes about 174,000 a year and is worth 30 million. And it shouldn't be a big surprise that her husband has been involved with some of this fraud that could be up to several $1 million. So far, there's only been civil proceedings and some money that they've paid back, but there has been no criminal charges. But I hope to God there will be at some point. So the total for everything I just mentioned is about 450 million a year. So how much are they putting into the system? So they do have a few decent sized businesses like Hoya Food, Afro Deli, and a lot of these smaller businesses in malls and markets. But still, all of these are considered small businesses that have less than 100 employees and generally make less than $10 million a year. And so in these malls and markets, there's about 1,000 Somali-owned businesses, and 84% are female run, which sounds great, but honestly, I don't think a lot of these stalls are making a ton of money. I don't see a lot of info about them getting into the trades. I think it's only about 10 to 15% of the population, but they are about 11% of the meatpacking industry, and a decent amount of them are into trucking. So how much are they paying in theory if you look at this? So here I'll just look at some of the local and state taxes and not the federal taxes. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of low-income households, which is 58%, so most of them aren't going to pay anything. But if you combine everyone else and property taxes, that's about 150 to 250 million. I mentioned it was a few like larger small businesses. That's about 2 to 4 million in taxes. And I guess the entire business ecosystem of all those malls and stuff is about 20 to 55 million in state and local taxes. So altogether, that's about 300 million a year. In theory, it could be less because we don't even know if they're paying a lot of these taxes. If they have such a large amount of fraud in general, I doubt everyone's being honest about what they're paying. And I doubt the IRS is going after most of them. So each year they probably cost up to 450 million with fraud and everything else. And they're only getting about 300 million in taxes. So that's about $150 million deficit. And I see this same thing when I look at African Americans. They basically end up taking out more than they put in. I'll do another video about that separately. So how could these groups improve economically, whether they're Somalians, blacks, or anyone in an economy? Well, as I mentioned, these small businesses are nice, but they really economically don't pay enough in taxes to sustain all the jobs or the economy in general. You need a lot of medium and large companies or corporations. For instance, even a Lowe's hardware store, which seems huge, doesn't have a big influence, as you might think. They might make around 50 million in revenue as far as gross sales go, but you have to deduct the costs of goods, rent, advertisement, credit card fees, insurance. The payroll alone is 7 to 9 million. And so in the end, they're only making about $3 to $5 million profit, and part of that's taxes. So in the end, a large multi-million-dollar business like Lowe's only ends up supporting about 150 people who are mostly making minimum wage or a little above. And there's really only a few people that are even going to make $100,000. And of course, the owner of the business and the corporation gets the rest. So if you've got 90,000 Somalis, about half of that population is working age. So that's 45,000 people. So 45,000 jobs you need to fill. And let's say these people really want to make good money. Let's say $100,000 a year. Then that's $4.5 billion alone. And like I said, that might be only payroll. The cost of a business is 75 to 95% more. That's why you need all these medium and large enterprises that are making tens of billions of dollars for the community to get healthcare, infrastructure, policing, and most of all, the government and local jobs that you're going to have to pay for, and all of the other jobs in the private sector. And then there's other things to consider. You've got $1.7 billion going back to Somalia each year. So you have tons of money leaving your own economy, which is possibly going to Al-Shabaab, which is Al-Qaeda basically. And what do you think they're trying to accomplish over there? They're trying to overthrow the already fragile government. And so the U.S. has already spent about $10 billion in Somalia in economic and military aid since the 90s, and that country's not even close to being stable. So we're paying money to try to stabilize a democracy over there, and then paying to bring refugees back here who are stealing the money and basically giving it to our enemies. And in both cases, we're losing money and not accomplishing anything. And from a political perspective, I'm sure you're aware, but Somalis, just like most blacks, are overwhelmingly going to support Democrats. It's at least 2/3 or more. There's been a bit of a backlash on the LGBT and a couple of other issues, and so some of them have been swayed to the Republicans, but overwhelmingly, they're still going for the Democrats. And many people like Ilhan Omar and the mayor that was just running has openly pledged allegiance to Somalia and seems to hate the U.S., even though U.S. citizens have paid billions of dollars to her country and to bring them back here. And most of these people were living in refugee camps in Kenya for years. You'd think they would be happy that they're living in a better environment that's much safer and they have much opportunities, but they still hate us. And of course, this is just how these people work. I mean, that's one of the reasons why things in their own country aren't working. They're very tribal. They can't share power. They don't accept other groups, and they don't accept us as well. And so bringing all these people here and all of these other ethnic groups in the U.S. has obviously changed the demographics in a huge way in the last few decades, which has changed the political dynamics of every city in the U.S. And now every major city in America is Democrat run. And this is a huge difference from the 1960s when just over half of the cities were run by Republicans. And now that's down to only 23 out of 100 cities. And now it would be different if all of these cities were so vibrant and had low crime and businesses were coming in. But these progressive policies that raise taxes will raise prices. They like to bring about more regulations, and all these things hurt businesses, which is why most of them have gone overseas. And at the same time, they're super lax on crime, which also brings prices up. And all of these criminals are wreaking havoc on the community. So if it's not just bad enough, they're raising taxes and we have to pay for them, but they're just making it more difficult for businesses to run, which is going to destroy the business and destroy your tax base, which is why you don't see a lot of medium or large enterprises in black areas in general, because of high crime, high taxes, and high regulations. And I'm not sure the extent of the Somali involvement, but it seems like most, if not the majority, were involved in the George Floyd riots, which not only destroyed a large portion of their own neighborhood, but it also cost $500 million, which I didn't even include before. And the downtown has continued to suffer for this reason. And of course, these demographic changes also change the dynamics of a city. For instance, one of the oldest bars had closed, and a lot of it looked like it was mismanagement. But you have to imagine that, like, Muslims obviously don't drink. So in those areas, it's not like you're going to have a vibrant bar scene. All of those bars and a lot of those businesses have to move and will get replaced with community centers or mosques or things related for another group. And then, of course, do you see a lot of people from the suburbs going into the black or Somali areas of the city for jobs? No, we're not getting like great jobs from this. They could come and work for white companies or work for the government, but you're not going to see that the other way around. So where did the economy of Minnesota and Minneapolis come from? It wasn't like the roads, buildings, and infrastructure just grew out of the ground. So in the late 1700s, many French and later British settlers came out and got involved in the fur trade with many of the native groups like the Dakota and Chippewa. By the mid-1800s, after Minnesota became a territory, many New Englanders, Norwegians, Germans, and Irish came out. They plowed the plains area and grew wheat, which brought in all these railroads. And then they cut down the forested areas and used the rivers to move the logs. The Mississippi River starts in Minnesota, and the only waterfall on the entire river is located in current-day Minneapolis, which is called St. Anthony Falls. It's not even that large of a waterfall, but they put in huge mills so they could process the flour and cut the wood. By 1900, that waterfall was powering the largest flour and sawmills in the world. Minneapolis was considered the flour capital of the world and one of the largest lumber sites in North America. They both had 1,500 to 25,000 people employed and generated billions of dollars in revenue in today's terms. Later, other industries emerged like mining, dairy, computer manufacturing, etc. You've probably heard of some companies like General Mills, Pillsbury, Land O'Lakes, Target, Best Buy, and several other large corporations are there, which are the medium and large industries you need to have to fuel this $400 billion economy. So in just a few decades, they were able to clear the land and carve out a multi-billion-dollar city, and they got nothing like cash assistance, housing, welfare, food stamps. These Somalis have gotten all this assistance for decades, and not only have they not created large businesses, but are scamming the system. Maybe it's just because they haven't had enough time, and maybe in the next decade or two they're going to have flying electric cars, but I doubt it. There was already tens of thousands of blacks that came into Minneapolis since the 1930s and after World War II. And although they were doing better to begin with and did have a lot of small businesses at least, that all went downhill in the 1960s when welfare was introduced. And by the late 60s, it was riots. And it's basically been downhill ever since. It only got worse with the George Floyd riots. The economy of Minnesota has been growing slower than most other American cities since 2019. And it's ironic that when most of the Somalis were coming to Minneapolis in the 90s, that's when crime was at one of the highest points in history. And so if it wasn't working out for the local 85 IQ Black Americans, why would it work for 70 IQ Somalians? Obviously it won't, and we know that, but we know who they're going to vote for, which is why they're there. I can only hope all this negative coverage brings down Ilhan Omar and many of these people, but some of these liberal judges are reversing the guilty verdicts in some of these cases, and many politicians are apologizing for having to prosecute them. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. This is The Hard Truth. If you enjoyed it, hit the like button and subscribe if you'd like to see more, and I'll see you next time.